Elon Musk had done something shocking, something so unbelievable, so utterly outrageous that the world wouldn't believe it if there weren't proof. A billionaire, a visionary, a man who had reshaped industries with nothing but ambition and audacity, yet for a brief moment, he was no one, just another face in the crowd, a man with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back. What happened next would shake the very foundation of the banking industry. It began in the sun-drenched streets of Beverly Hills, where the scent of wealth hung thick in the air. The sidewalks shimmered, polished by the footfalls of the elite. Ferraris and Bentleys glided past, their drivers wrapped in tailored suits and designer sunglasses. This was a kingdom of power, where money spoke louder than words, and where those without it might as well have been invisible. But not today. A figure walked down the street, his movements unhurried, his presence unremarkable. His shoes were battered, his clothes threadbare, his beard unkempt. His head was bowed just enough to avoid eye contact, just enough to blend into the background, just enough to be ignored. And that was exactly the point. This was no ordinary man. Beneath the layers of grime and faded fabric was Elon Musk, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men on the planet. He had built empires, launched rockets, and revolutionized entire industries. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was here to see the world from the other side. The plan had been simple. Strip away the symbols of power, remove the aura of prestige, become invisible. The disguise had been carefully crafted. Worn sneakers, oversized clothes that sagged from his frame, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had spent hours studying the way the forgotten moved, how they carried themselves, how they avoided the gaze of those who judged them unworthy. Today, he was not a billionaire. He was not an innovator. He was not a name that commanded headlines. He was just a man with nowhere to go and nothing to his name. The bank towered ahead of him, its glass facade gleaming under the relentless sun. It was a fortress of wealth, its doors open only to those deemed worthy. The air inside was crisp, the scent of polished leather and fresh espresso filling the space. High ceilings, marble floors, and golden accents spoke of exclusivity, of a world where money was not just a necessity but an identity. Conversations hummed in hushed tones, the quiet arrogance of the privileged filling the room. Every movement was precise, every interaction a performance of affluence. The moment he stepped inside, the shift was immediate. Conversations faltered, glances flickered toward him, eyes narrowing with silent judgment. He was not meant to be here. He did not belong. He was an intrusion in a place designed to keep people like him out. He had expected it, anticipated it, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. At the reception desk, the atmosphere was laced with a thinly veiled discomfort. The staff moved with efficiency, their words polished and practiced, but their eyes betrayed them. They saw not a potential client, but an inconvenience, an unwelcome disruption to their carefully curated environment. There was no warmth in their expressions, no courtesy in their gaze. He was not a person to them. He was a problem to be removed. The rejection came swiftly, delivered with the kind of effortless condescension that only came from years of dealing with the unwanted. The rules were simple, the expectations clear. This was not a place for those who had nothing. The numbers mattered more than the person. The appearance mattered more than the need. The unspoken truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Without money, there was no value. Without wealth, there was no respect. He had known it would happen, but the ease with which it did was unsettling. There was no hesitation, no consideration, no moment of doubt. He had been dismissed before he had even truly begun. But not everyone in the room had looked away. Amidst the indifference, there had been one pair of eyes that held something different. A flicker of hesitation, a shadow of discomfort, a quiet defiance against the norm. She was young, no more than a few years into her career. Her colleagues moved with the certainty of those who had long since accepted the rules, but she hesitated. There was something in her expression, a conflict between duty and conscience. She had seen what happened. She had heard the dismissal, felt the weight of it, and something about it had unsettled her. As he turned to leave, he caught her glance once more. There was something in it, something unspoken. He would remember her. She didn't know it yet, but she had already changed the course of her own story. The sun burned hot outside, but the coldness of the interaction lingered. The streets bustled with life, the hum of a city that moved too fast to notice those who had fallen behind. He sat on a bench, the weight of the moment settling over him. The world he had spent his life building felt distant now, a reality separate from this one. It was easy to forget, from the heights of power, what it felt like to be powerless. Inside the bank, the young woman struggled to focus. The day continued as it always had, but something was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something important. The laughter of her colleagues, the dismissive comments, the certainty that they had done the right thing, it all felt wrong. She had always believed in fairness and treating people with dignity. But today she had done nothing. Today she had watched and stayed silent. That night, sleep did not come easily. The image of the man at the counter lingered in her mind, his quiet dignity in the face of rejection. There had been no anger in his eyes, no desperation in his voice, just a calm acceptance of a reality that should not have been. She could not change the past, but tomorrow she could make a choice. Tomorrow she could do something different. The next morning he was back, sitting on the same bench watching the world move around him. He had no plans to return to the bank, not yet. He had learned what he needed to learn, but he was curious. The young woman had stood out, and he wanted to know if she was different, if she would be the one to break the cycle. Inside, she made her decision. The rules were clear, the expectations set, but something in her refused to accept them. She had seen something yesterday that she could not ignore. The man had been cast aside, treated as though he did not matter, and yet she had felt the weight of that moment in a way her colleagues had not. It was not just about him. It was about the system, about the way the world worked, about how easy it was to look away. She stepped outside, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly. The man on the bench turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. She had no idea what she was about to do, no plan, no certainty. But she knew one thing. She would not stay silent today. What happened next would change everything. Elon Musk remained seated on the bench, watching the world unfold around him, but his focus was solely on the young woman standing before him. There was hesitation in her stance, uncertainty in her eyes. She had taken the first step, but she wasn't yet sure why. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the unspoken. She had seen what had happened the day before, had felt the injustice of it in a way her colleagues had not. She had gone home thinking about it, questioning everything she had been taught about her job, about the rules she was expected to follow, and now, here she was, standing before the man who had been dismissed so easily, knowing she had the power to make a different choice. The city moved around them, indifferent to the quiet revolution taking place in that moment. Cars rolled past, their drivers wrapped in the comfort of their daily routines. Pedestrians hurried by, their conversations blending into the hum of urban life. Inside the bank, business continued as usual, wealth exchanging hands, decisions made without a second thought for those who didn't meet the unspoken requirements. But here, on this bench, something was shifting. She sat down beside him, her movements measured, uncertain but determined. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the tension of a decision yet to be made. She had never done anything like this before. Her job had always been simple: follow the rules, meet the quotas, serve the clients who fit the mold. But yesterday had shown her something she couldn't unsee. She had expected him to be bitter, to be angry at the way he had been treated. Instead, he was calm, composed, as if he had known all along how things would play out. It unsettled her. The certainty of his rejection, the predictability of the outcome, it meant this wasn't an isolated incident. This was just the way the world worked, and that realization was unbearable. The bank loomed behind them, its pristine windows reflecting the morning sun. It was a place of power, a place where decisions were made based on perception rather than need. She had always thought she was helping people, that her role in finance meant providing security and opportunity. But what kind of institution turned someone away without even listening? What kind of system decided a person's worth before they even spoke? She had made up her mind before she even sat down. She didn't know what it would cost her, didn't know if she would regret it later. But in this moment, she knew she couldn't walk away again. She had already chosen to stay silent once. She wouldn't do it a second time. The day inside the bank unfolded in the usual way, customers arriving in polished shoes, transactions flowing effortlessly between accounts, the quiet undercurrent of exclusivity pulsing through every interaction. But something was different. The young woman moved with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The rules were still there, the expectations unchanged, but she was no longer content to simply follow them. When he walked back through the glass doors, the reaction was immediate. The carefully constructed atmosphere of wealth and order tensed at his presence, the illusion momentarily disrupted by someone who did not belong. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Conversations faltered. Eyes flickered toward the reception desk, waiting for the inevitable dismissal. The woman at the counter barely concealed her impatience. Her fingers tapped against the polished surface, her smile as practiced as it was insincere. There was no question about what would happen next. He would be turned away again, swiftly and without hesitation. The bank had no place for someone like him. But this time he wasn't alone. From across the room, the young woman stood, her heart pounding against her ribs. She moved toward the counter, her footsteps measured but unshakable. The moment she spoke, the energy in the room shifted. The carefully rehearsed dismissal faltered. The usual script had been interrupted. The other employees exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. The receptionist hesitated, her authority suddenly uncertain. The rules had never been questioned before. The process had never been disrupted. The young woman knew she was pushing the limits of what was acceptable, knew she was risking her position, her career, maybe even her future. But she had already accepted that. If her job required her to look the other way when people were turned away simply because they didn't fit the right image, then maybe it wasn't a job she wanted after all. She guided him to her desk, ignoring the whispers that followed her. Her hands were steady as she pulled up the necessary documents, her voice even as she explained the process. It was such a small thing, an action that should have been routine, unremarkable, and yet in this moment, it felt monumental. A silence settled over the bank, heavy with disbelief. Her colleagues watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of confusion and quiet disapproval. This wasn't how things were done. The unspoken rules had been broken. The lines that had always divided people had been blurred. And then, it was done. The transaction was processed, the documents finalized. A simple account, nothing more. And yet it meant everything. The moment stretched between them as she handed him the receipt, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. There was no need for thanks, no words required to acknowledge what had just happened. They both understood. When he left the bank, the tension in the room remained. The whispers had grown louder, the disapproval more pointed. She felt the weight of their stares, the silent reprimands hidden behind polite professionalism. But she didn't regret it. The call to the manager's office came sooner than she expected. The office was just as imposing as the rest of the building, polished, pristine, an extension of the power it represented. The man behind the desk was calm, measured, his words carefully chosen. He was not angry, not yet. But he was watching her closely, assessing the situation, deciding whether this was a mistake or something more. The questions came, each one laced with quiet authority. Why had she gone against policy? Why had she intervened? What had she been thinking? She had no perfect answer, no justification that would fit neatly into the structure they had built. She could have apologized, could have promised to follow the rules more carefully next time. But she didn't. Instead, she told the truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. The manager's expression didn't change, but she could see the calculation behind his eyes. She had made herself visible in a way she never had before. Whether that was a mistake or something more remained to be seen. When she left the office, her hands were shaking, but her resolve was not. Later that night, as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message was short, simple, and yet it sent a shiver through her. She had taken a risk, and now something was happening. She had no idea what came next, but she knew without a doubt that her life was no longer the same. Tomorrow would bring something new, and this time she was ready. The next morning, the weight of uncertainty clung to Clara as she stepped through the bank's glass doors. The usual routine unfolded around her, staff moving with quiet efficiency, clients exchanging pleasantries, the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. But beneath the surface, everything felt different. Whispers followed her. Stares lingered longer than usual. She was no longer just another trainee blending into the background. She had disrupted the system, broken an unspoken rule, and now the consequences were beginning to take shape. Her desk felt smaller, the air around her heavier. The manager had not spoken to her again, but she knew it was only a matter of time. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but deep down, she did not regret her decision. She had done something that felt right, something that mattered. And yet the fear remained. Had she just thrown away everything she had worked for? By mid-morning, the bank's glass doors swung open again, and the air in the room shifted. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw him. He was back. But this time, something was different. Gone were the ragged clothes, the worn-out shoes, the slouched posture of a man ignored by society. Instead, he moved with an undeniable presence, his steps slow but deliberate, his eyes sharp and observant. The disguise was gone. In its place stood Elon Musk, not a man struggling to open a bank account, but a man who owned industries, changed economies, and built futures. The room stilled. The same staff who had dismissed him 2 days ago now straightened their backs, their faces shifting into expressions of careful politeness. Recognition sparked in their eyes, followed quickly by panic. The whispers that had followed Clara were nothing compared to the storm of hushed voices now rippling through the room. He had returned, and this time, he was not invisible. Every step he took toward her desk was deliberate, the controlled pace of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The weight of 1,000 unspoken words hung between them as he finally reached her desk. The moment stretched, the world around them falling into silence. She knew now. It had never been about opening an account. It had never been about money. He had come to see what would happen, to see if the system was as broken as he believed it to be. And it was. He had been turned away, dismissed, treated as though he did not matter. And now every single person in this room who had ignored him, who had whispered about him, who had laughed at the idea of a man with $20 opening an account, every single one of them knew the truth. The realization sank into their bones with a quiet, crushing inevitability. The manager emerged from his office, his face pale as he took in the sight of the man who now held the room in the palm of his hand. The stiffness in his posture betrayed his nervousness. He opened his mouth, most likely to offer some form of damage control, but Elon Musk did not acknowledge him. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded document, and placed it on Clara's desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. It was an offer, not a reprimand, not a warning, a job offer. The world around her blurred as she read the words, the meaning sinking in slowly, piece by piece. This wasn't just a position. This was something bigger. A new beginning. A chance to do something real, something meaningful. A chance to walk away from a place that had shown her its true colors and into something that aligned with what she had always believed in. The silence in the room was deafening as she looked up at him. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation. Just a simple certainty, as though he had known all along that she was capable of more than this. Her decision was made before she even opened her mouth. She stood up, the weight of the past 2 days lifting from her shoulders. The whispers grew louder, shock rippling through the room like a current. The manager took a step forward, as if about to protest, but it didn't matter. Clara was already walking away. The bank, the rules, the suffocating structure of a system built on exclusion. All of it faded behind her as she stepped through the glass doors and into the unknown. For the first time, she felt free. The weeks that followed were unlike anything she had ever experienced. The office she stepped into was a world away from the one she had left behind. Sleek, modern, alive with the hum of innovation. She was surrounded by people who didn't just accept change but created it, who saw problems and solved them, who believed in a world where financial systems didn't just serve the privileged, but everyone. Her role wasn't just a job, it was a mission. The blueprint of a banking revolution unfolded before her, its foundation built on accessibility, equity, and the radical notion that every person, regardless of their status, deserved respect. She worked side by side with some of the most brilliant minds in finance and technology, learning, growing, shaping the very future of the industry she had once believed was unchangeable. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles, new battles to fight. The resistance was fierce. The established financial institutions scoffed at their ideas, dismissed their efforts, clung desperately to the outdated systems that had served them so well for so long. But change had already begun, and no amount of opposition could stop the momentum now. One project after another launched: mobile banking for underserved communities, financial literacy programs for those shut out of traditional institutions, streamlined services designed to welcome, not exclude. The success of the initiative spread quickly, reaching communities, businesses, and individuals who had never before been given a seat at the table. Clara had never worked harder, and yet, for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Months passed, and the project grew beyond what anyone had imagined. The movement was no longer just an idea, it was a reality, shifting the very foundation of the financial world. The whispers of doubt from industry leaders turned to discussions, then negotiations, then full-scale adoption of the principles they had pioneered. And then one day, Clara found herself standing at the front of a crowded room, the eyes of financial executives, economists, and policymakers fixed on her as she spoke. She told them about what she had seen, about the moment she had realized that the system was broken, about the day she had chosen to walk away from what was easy and into something unknown. She spoke of the forgotten, of the people who had been turned away, dismissed, deemed unworthy not because of who they were, but because of what they lacked. She spoke of a future where that would no longer be the case. And when she finished, the silence was followed by something she never expected: applause. Later that evening, as she stood on the balcony of her new office, watching the city lights flicker below, she felt a presence beside her. Elon Musk stood next to her, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. She had done it. She had taken a risk, made a choice, and changed the course of her own life. And in doing so, she had changed the lives of so many others. The future was uncertain, the road ahead still long and filled with challenges. But as Clara stood there, looking out over the city she once thought would never change, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.